My mother called immigration saying my husband was illegal and dangerous. After 8 months of proceedings, $95 in legal fees, and nearly losing our house, I discovered she wanted me to move back in with her because she was lonely. 3 federal immigration agents knocked on my door on a freezing Tuesday morning in January, when accumulated snow in the neighborhood yards created a silent, surreal landscape that contrasted brutally with the absolute chaos that was about to explode into my carefully constructed life over the last 6 years of happy marriage and hard-won emotional stability. It was exactly 6:17 in the morning, a time permanently etched in my memory as the precise moment when my peaceful 37-year existence, built on foundations of family trust, honest work as a nurse at a public hospital, and especially on the genuine love I shared with my immigrant husband who had arrived legally in the country 5 years earlier, completely crumbled before my still sleep-swollen eyes. The violent and insistent sound of knocking on the solid wood door we had chosen together during our home renovation cut through the morning silence like an explosion, abruptly interrupting the tranquil ritual of making coffee, while Marco still slept soundly in the bedroom after a double shift at the restaurant where he had worked as a chef ever since finally obtaining his permanent work permit through meticulously fulfilled legal processes. When I opened the heavy door with trembling hands and heart already racing from some primitive instinct detecting imminent danger, I found 3 uniformed people holding official immigration service badges, their severe and impersonal expressions creating an atmosphere of intimidating authority that instantly made me feel as if I had committed some terrible crime I was completely unaware of. The lead agent, a tall and imposing man of approximately 43 years with rigid military posture and brown eyes that seemed to assess every detail of my reaction with professionally trained precision, held a black folder filled with stamped official documents that gleamed under the dim hallway light while snow continued falling silently outside. And when he finally spoke, his voice had that bureaucratic coldness characteristic of government officials who had transformed the destruction of lives into routine administrative procedures. Mrs. Jessica Anderson, my name is Officer Martinez, Federal Immigration and Border Control Service, and we're here to execute an investigation warrant and possible detention of Mr. Marco Santos due to a formal complaint received 3 weeks ago alleging serious violations of immigration laws, irregular stay on national territory, and behaviors representing potential threat to public safety, he said, meticulously consulting his papers while I remained completely paralyzed in my own doorway. Still wearing my navy blue flannel pajamas and fuzzy slippers that Marco had given me as a gift on my last birthday, trying to mentally process words that sounded like deportation sentences pronounced in incomprehensible legal language that transformed my honest, hardworking husband into a dangerous criminal. My 37 years of responsible and carefully planned life seemed to have become irrelevant before those incomprehensible accusations that instantly transformed our secure reality into a Kafkaesque nightmare, worthy of the worst films about government injustices. During all the years Marco had been in the country, we religiously fulfilled every legal requirement demanded by immigration services through endless but necessary bureaucratic procedures. He had originally entered with a valid student visa for a professional culinary course at an accredited school, renewed all documents within established deadlines, paying exorbitant but mandatory fees, subsequently obtained work permission through sponsorship from the restaurant that employed him, recognizing his exceptional culinary skills, and finally obtained permanent resident status after our officially registered marriage, approved by competent authorities after detailed interviews where we proved the legitimacy of our relationship through photographs, testimonies from friends, joint bank statements, and every imaginable document demonstrating that our marriage was genuine and not a fraudulent scheme for obtaining documentation. The sensation was exactly like receiving a devastating medical diagnosis of terminal illness when you had just done routine exams expecting only confirmation of perfect health. I instantly awoke from an apparently secure life into a bureaucratic nightmare that would become my reality for the next 8 months of legal battles, unbearable emotional tension, and especially financial expenses that would completely drain our carefully accumulated savings for purchasing the house where we planned to raise children in the near future. Officer Martinez, there must be some absurd administrative error or monumental confusion of identities because my husband Marco possesses all necessary legal documents, permanent resident status approved 2 years ago, valid work permit, and especially has never committed any violation of immigration laws or any other type of crime during all the time he's been in this country. I managed to respond with a trembling voice coming from my throat constricted by growing anxiety that made me feel as if I were slowly suffocating. But the officer merely handed me a yellowed copy of the official documents containing the formal complaint, and explained with mechanical bureaucratic patience that they had a legal obligation to investigate all allegations received through official channels, regardless of their apparent credibility or lack thereof. Because ignoring complaints could result in serious consequences if they later proved true, and the Immigration Service was held responsible for negligence in fulfilling their duties to protect national security. The weight of the documents in my trembling hands that seemed to be moving independently of my conscious will seemed disproportionate to the cheap paper on which they were printed. There was the formal accusation that transformed my loving and hardworking husband into a supposed threat to public order, described in cold legal terms that reduced our happy married life to case numbers. Obscure legal codes and administrative procedures that completely ignored the humanity of people whose destinies were being decided through those impersonal papers. When I finally managed to mentally process the initial shock and read with more focused attention the detailed content of the formal complaint that the federal agents had handed me, I felt as if the solid floor of my house had literally disappeared beneath my feet, leaving me falling freely through an abyss of disbelief and growing horror that made me question my own mental sanity. The complaint alleged with specific details and apparently well-informed information that Marco had entered the country illegally through unauthorized borders using falsified documentation, that his visas and work permits were fraudulent obtained through bribing corrupt officials, that he had serious criminal records in his country of origin, including accusations of domestic violence and trafficking in illegal substances, and especially that he represented a direct threat to my personal safety due to aggressive and controlling behaviors he supposedly demonstrated regularly within our marital relationship. Each accusation was more absurd and disconnected from reality than the previous one, creating a completely fictional portrait of a dangerous and criminal man who bore absolutely no resemblance to the real Marco I had known intimately for more than 6 years of progressively deeper and more loving relationship. The most disturbing and confusing aspect of that entire surreal situation wasn't even the absurd accusations themselves, but rather the impressive amount of specific and personal details contained in the formal complaint that clearly demonstrated that whoever had made those false allegations possessed intimate knowledge about our lives, our daily routines, our current and previous residential addresses, the places where we worked, and especially information about Marco's immigration history that only people very close to our family could know with such precision. The complaint correctly mentioned Marco's full name, including his middle name, which he rarely used, the exact date of his arrival in the country 5 years earlier, the specific name of the culinary school where he had studied, the precise address of the restaurant where he currently worked, and even details about our marriage, including the exact date of the ceremony, and the name of the small and discreet church where we had held the intimate celebration with only 20 close guests. This precise information mixed with completely false accusations created a toxic combination that lent superficial credibility to the allegations in the eyes of Immigration Service officials who didn't know us personally and had only those official documents as a basis for making decisions that could permanently destroy our lives. When Marco finally woke up to the noise of tense voices in the living room and came stumbling sleepily down the hallway, still wearing only pajama pants and a worn t-shirt, his black hair disheveled and dark eyes confused, trying to understand why there were uniformed federal agents in our living room at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, the expression of absolute shock and terror that settled on his olive face when Officer Martinez formally explained the reason for the visit was one of the most painful things I've ever witnessed in my entire adult life. Watching the man I loved deeply being treated as a dangerous criminal by government authorities. Observing his eyes fill with tears of frustration and fear, while he tried to explain in Portuguese still marked by a noticeable foreign accent that he had meticulously complied with all laws and didn't understand how those absurd accusations could have been made against him. Witnessing his hands tremble violently while he desperately searched for his immigration documents, carefully kept in a special folder we always kept updated. All of this made me feel an overwhelming mixture of impotent rage against the unjust bureaucratic system, paralyzing fear about the uncertain future awaiting us, and especially a fierce determination to protect my innocent husband against those completely unfounded accusations that threatened to destroy everything we had built together during years of hard work and mutual sacrifices. The federal agents spent the next 3 hours meticulously searching every room of our modest but comfortable house that we had gradually furnished with objects carefully chosen during trips to thrift stores and flea markets on weekends, looking for evidence of illegal activities or fraudulent documentation that could support the serious accusations contained in the formal complaint that someone had maliciously submitted against Marco. Watching uniformed strangers opening our personal drawers, leafing through family photo albums, examining private correspondence, rummaging through clothing closets, and especially handling intimate objects that had deep emotional meaning for us, like the set of professional knives I had given Marco as a gift on his last birthday, celebrating his passion for cooking. All of this created a visceral sensation of invasion and violation that made me feel simultaneously furious and powerless before the institutional power those agents represented. Marco remained seated rigidly on the living room sofa during the entire search. His immigration documents spread over the coffee table where the agents repeatedly examined them, comparing photographs, dates, and official stamps. His expression oscillating between hope that the papers would prove his innocence and growing terror that some obscure technical detail might be misinterpreted as evidence of irregularity. When the agents finally concluded their invasive inspection and found absolutely no physical evidence supporting the dramatic accusations of the anonymous complaint, Officer Martinez explained in a neutral professional tone that although there was no reason for Marco's immediate detention at that moment, he was officially under active investigation by the Immigration Service and would be summoned for formal hearings where he would have the opportunity to respond to the allegations and present documentary evidence proving the legitimacy of his permanent resident status. Mr. Marco Santos, you must appear at the preliminary hearing, scheduled 14 business days from now at the Regional Immigration Service Office, bringing all original documents related to your entry into the country, visas, work permits, and any other documentation that can prove the legality of your stay on national territory, the officer said, handing over a sealed official envelope containing the formal summons and a detailed list of required documents. Failure to appear at the hearing will automatically result in a detention warrant and initiation of summary deportation proceedings. Therefore, it is absolutely essential that you be present at the designated time accompanied by qualified legal representation, if you so desire. After the federal agents finally left, leaving our house transformed into an emotional battlefield with open drawers, scattered documents, and especially a heavy atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that seemed to have physically impregnated the walls and furniture around us, Marco completely broke down in convulsive crying that I had never witnessed during all the years we had been together. Seeing that strong and proud 41-year-old man who had overcome immense obstacles to build a dignified life in a foreign country where he had originally arrived knowing no one, who worked double shifts at the restaurant to save money for our joint future, who had studied English with admirable dedication until he could communicate fluently despite the accent he would probably carry forever, now reduced to a state of devastating emotional vulnerability by completely false accusations that threatened to destroy everything he had achieved through honest effort. This vision broke my heart in ways I hadn't imagined were possible. Jessica, I don't understand how this is happening. I swear by everything sacred that I complied with all laws, that I have all the correct documents, that I never did anything wrong, he repeated between sobs that made his broad shoulders tremble, his large hands calloused from hard work in the restaurant kitchen holding mine with desperate strength, as if I were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become completely unstable and threatening. During the days following that traumatic morning that permanently divided our life into before and after the malicious complaint, I plunged into desperate and obsessive research trying to understand who could have made such serious and detailed accusations against Marco, and especially what could be the motivation behind such a calculated attack against our peaceful family that had never consciously harmed anyone. I searched my recent memory looking for significant conflicts with neighbors, coworkers, casual acquaintances, or anyone who might have developed resentments intense enough to justify such malice directed against us. But I couldn't identify any problematic interaction that explained that extreme hostility manifested through the formal complaint to immigration services. Marco and I led a deliberately discreet and quiet life. Maintaining cordial but superficial relationships with neighbors, we greeted politely when we met, but rarely invited inside our house, focusing our social energies on a small circle of close friends we had known for years, and in whom we trusted completely, based on a long history of loyalty, demonstrated through concrete actions. The first clue about the origin of the malicious complaint emerged when I finally gained access through the specialized immigration attorney we hired, using a large portion of our savings carefully guarded for emergencies, to a more complete copy of the official documents that had been submitted to the Immigration Service, along with the accusations against Marco. Attorney Daniel was an experienced man of 48 years with 2 decades of practice in complex immigration cases, his brown hair already showing premature gray strands due to the stress of constantly dealing with situations where bureaucratic errors or intentional malice by third parties could result in permanent separation of families. unjust deportations of people who had built entire lives in the country, and destruction of dreams patiently cultivated during years of honest work and meticulous compliance with all legal requirements. Jessica and Marco. Unfortunately, cases like yours are more common than the general public imagines. False anonymous complaints to immigration services are frequently used as weapons by people who want to harm immigrants for reasons ranging from pure xenophobia to personal vengeance related to labor disputes, romantic conflicts, or simply envy of others' success. Daniel explained to us during our first consultation at his modest but professional office located in an old commercial building in the city center, its walls covered with diplomas, specialization certificates, and especially photographs of successful clients he had helped regularize their immigration situations over the years. Daniel meticulously examined all our documents during that initial consultation that extended for almost 3 hours, while he asked detailed questions about every aspect of Marco's immigration history, our relationship timeline, the circumstances of our marriage, and especially about people in our lives who could have sufficiently detailed knowledge about personal information to make such a precise complaint in some aspects, although completely false in the main accusations. What strikes me about this specific complaint is the extraordinary level of detail about correct aspects of your lives mixed with serious but completely unverifiable accusations. This strongly suggests that the person responsible for the complaint knows you personally in an intimate way, has access to private information about dates, addresses, and documentation, but consciously decided to fabricate criminal allegations, knowing they would be investigated, causing enormous suffering, even when eventually disproven. Daniel observed with a serious expression, revealing genuine professional concern. We need to make a complete list of all people who have or had access to Marco's immigration documents, who know specific details about when and how he entered the country, and especially who could have motivation to cause significant damage to your relationship or legal situation. It was during this painful exercise of systematically listing all people with potential access to sufficiently detailed private information to make that specific complaint that a name emerged in my mind with the devastating force of a terrible revelation. My own mother, Patricia, a 62-year-old woman whom I had religiously visited at least twice a month since I moved out of her house 7 years ago to live independently after meeting Marco, and to whom I had naively entrusted all the most intimate details about our relationship, our future plans, and especially about Marco's complex bureaucratic journey to regularize his immigration situation that she had followed through my detailed narratives during our weekly phone conversations and monthly visits, where I shared each new development with the enthusiasm of a daughter who genuinely believed she had unconditional maternal support for her marital happiness. The mere possibility that Patricia could be responsible for that malicious complaint made me feel physically nauseated, my stomach contracting in painful spasms while specific memories began to reorganize in my mind, under a new disturbing light that revealed patterns of behavior I had misinterpreted or deliberately ignored during recent years. Patricia had never fully approved of my relationship with Marco from the moment she met him 6 years earlier during a tense family dinner where she spent the entire night making subtly deprecating comments about cultural differences, language barriers, and especially expressing veiled concerns about difficulties of marrying a foreigner that she presented as well. Intentioned maternal advice, but that Marco and I had interpreted as simply normal initial resistance from an overprotective mother that would eventually dissipate when she realized our relationship was genuine and healthy. During the following years, her objections to our marriage had gradually become more explicit and dramatic, evolving from occasional passive, aggressive comments during visits to long emotional speeches during nighttime phone calls, where she expressed maternal anguish about how I was wasting my life with someone who, according to her, would never be truly accepted by society due to his foreign origin and noticeable accent that would always mark him as an outsider regardless of how many years he lived in the country or how perfectly he complied with all immigration laws and regulations. I now remember with painful clarity a particularly disturbing specific conversation we had approximately 3 months before the complaint to immigration services. During a routine visit to the small but impeccably clean apartment where Patricia had lived alone since my father's death 8 years earlier, a traumatic event that had profoundly transformed her previously sociable and independent personality into something progressively more reclusive, dependent, and especially emotionally manipulative in relation to me as her only daughter, and therefore only close relative she had left. During that tense visit marked by awkward silences interspersed with forced superficial conversations, Patricia had suddenly and dramatically begun to cry while holding my hands across the dining table where we were having tea. her tears running down her wrinkled cheeks while she lamented about the unbearable loneliness she felt living alone, about how the house seemed empty and purposeless since I had moved out to build an independent life with Marco, and especially about how wonderful it would be if I came back home where I belonged, so we could be a family again like in the good old days. Jessica, my dear daughter, you can't imagine how terrible it is to wake up every day in this silent house, knowing you're living across town with a stranger instead of being here with me, where I could take care of you and you could take care of me in our final years, she had said, with a voice choked by sobs that seemed simultaneously genuine and performative in ways that left me confused about how I should respond appropriately. At the time of that disturbing conversation, I had interpreted Patricia's dramatic words as simply a comprehensible manifestation of loneliness from an elderly widow struggling to adapt to independent life after decades of marriage. And I had gently but firmly explained that, although I loved her deeply and would always visit regularly to ensure her well-being, my life was now permanently intertwined with Marco's, and there was no possibility of me coming back home as she suggested, because my true home was now with my husband in the house we had bought together, and where we planned to eventually raise our own children. Patricia had reacted to my gentle refusal with icy silence that lasted the remainder of the visit, her expression alternating between exaggerated sadness and something that at the time seemed to me merely maternal frustration, but that I now, in retrospect, recognize as poorly disguised anger from someone whose selfish desires were being thwarted by healthy boundaries established by an independent adult daughter. Confronting Patricia about the possibility that she had made the malicious complaint to immigration services was one of the most difficult and emotionally devastating decisions I had to make in my entire adult life, because it meant accepting that my own mother could be capable of such calculated cruelty against me and against an innocent man I loved deeply. During entire days after that gradual revelation of terrible possibility, I struggled internally between the natural impulse to defend Patricia based on decades of generally positive maternal relationship during my childhood and adolescence, and growing circumstantial evidence that pointed increasingly clearly toward her as the only person with access, knowledge, and especially specific motivation to make exactly that type of detailed but malicious complaint that could potentially result in Marco's deportation, and consequently my forced return to the maternal home where Patricia desperately wanted me to come back and live. The final confrontation happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon. When I drove alone to Patricia's apartment without previously announcing my visit, because I knew intuitively that if she had time to prepare psychologically, she would develop elaborate defensive narratives that would make it impossible to extract the truth about her role in the complaint to immigration services. When she opened the door, showing genuine surprise at seeing me appear unexpectedly, I immediately noticed, through years of intimate knowledge about her facial microexpressions, that there was something different in her posture and especially in her gaze. A strange combination of anticipated guilt and defensive defiance that instantly confirmed my terrible suspicions even before I formulated the first accusatory question. "Mom, I need to ask you something extremely serious, and I need you to be absolutely honest with me, regardless of how difficult it may be to admit. Were you responsible for the anonymous complaint to immigration services alleging that Marco is in the country illegally and represents danger to my safety?" I asked directly without diplomatic circumlocution, carefully observing every nuance of her reaction to detect lies through nonverbal signals I had learned to recognize during 37 years of maternal relationship. The silence that followed my direct question lasted long enough to definitively confirm that my terrible suspicion was absolutely correct. Patricia didn't immediately deny with genuine indignation as any innocent person would when falsely accused of such a serious crime against their own daughter, but rather remained paralyzed with an expression that rapidly alternated between obvious guilt, fear of consequences, and especially a kind of irrational defiance from someone who had committed a terrible act but still believed in a distorted way that her selfish motivations justified the cruel methods employed to achieve personal objectives. When she finally broke that revealing silence, her first words weren't denial but rather defensive justification that completely confirmed my accusation even before explicit admission. "Jessica, you need to understand the impossible situation you put me in when you decided to abandon your lonely mother to live with a foreigner who doesn't even speak our language correctly," she said with a voice mixing self-pity with unjustified indignation, as if she were the victim of some injustice I had committed against her, instead of the criminal who had consciously tried to destroy my marriage through malicious complaint to federal authorities. Patricia's complete confession came gradually during hours of intense emotional confrontation, where I alternated between justified anger and devastating sadness upon discovering the complete extent of the maternal betrayal she had planned and meticulously executed during months before finally submitting the formal complaint to immigration services. Patricia admitted while crying that she had indeed made the anonymous complaint 3 months earlier, filling out official online forms through a public computer at a library to avoid tracking to her personal address, using all the detailed information I had naively shared with her during years about Marco's immigration process, mixing true facts about dates and documentation with completely fabricated accusations about supposed criminal activities and violent behaviors she knew were false, but hoped would be serious enough to result in prolonged investigation and possibly deportation. Dear daughter, you don't understand the terrible loneliness I feel every day in this silent apartment since your father died, and you abandoned me to live with a foreigner who took you away from your own family. She tried to justify her actions through emotional arguments that transformed victim into culprit and criminal into misunderstood martyr. I thought that if Marco were deported for immigration problems, you would finally realize the mistake you made marrying him and would come back home where you belong, where we could be a family again, and I wouldn't have to spend the rest of my life completely alone waiting for occasional visits when you have spare time after taking care of your foreign husband first. Patricia continued her confession that revealed not only the extent of her betrayal, but also the depth of her psychological distortion that had convinced her that deliberately destroying her own daughter's happiness was an act of maternal love, instead of cruel selfishness disguised as concern. Each word of her justification made me feel simultaneously furious at the calculated malice of her acts, and deeply sad at the transformation of the woman who had been a loving mother during my childhood into a person capable of causing such immense suffering for purely selfish motivations related to her own inability to build a meaningful, independent life after widowhood. Patricia's revelations about the complete extent of her betrayal included details that made the situation even more disturbing. She had spent weeks researching complaint procedures to immigration services through online forums and government websites, had deliberately chosen specific accusations she knew would be taken extremely seriously by federal authorities, due to the serious nature of allegations about domestic violence and threats to public safety, and especially had coldly calculated that even when accusations were eventually disproven through complete investigation, the prolonged legal process would cause sufficient emotional and financial stress to potentially destroy my marriage through unsustainable external pressures. I didn't really want Marco to be arrested or deported permanently. I just wanted to scare you both enough so you would rethink the decisions you were making and consider coming back home, where you would be much happier and safer than living with a foreigner who will never truly be one of us. She tried to minimize the seriousness of her actions as if they were merely a severe lesson intended to make me see errors instead of federal crimes that could have resulted in catastrophic, irreversible consequences for an innocent person's life. The decision to completely cut off my relationship with Patricia after discovering the complete extent of her betrayal was made without hesitation, because I instantly understood that a person capable of such calculated malice against her own daughter represented a continuing danger to my emotional well-being and especially to the safety of my family with Marco. Patricia, I want you to understand with absolute clarity that our maternal relationship ended permanently at this moment, due to the conscious choices you made in trying to deliberately destroy my marriage through malicious complaint to federal authorities. I declared with a firm voice that left no room for negotiation or future possibility of reconciliation. A true mother protects her children's happiness even when it means accepting they've built independent lives. You chose to try to destroy my happiness out of pure selfishness, transforming yourself into a threat instead of a source of love and support. The following 8 months were an intense period of legal battles, devastating financial stress, and especially emotional reconstruction after discovering that a person I had trusted unconditionally throughout my entire life had deliberately tried to destroy everything I valued. With Daniel's assistance, we managed to definitively prove that all accusations in the complaint were completely false through presentation of meticulous documentation about Marco's legal immigration history, verification of clean criminal background checks both in the current country and country of origin, detailed testimonies from friends and colleagues testifying about Marco's exemplary character and the completely healthy nature of our marital relationship, and especially through investigation that revealed the origin of the malicious complaint and selfish motivation behind the fabricated accusations. The legal process cost exactly $95,000 that completely drained our savings and forced us to consider selling the house we had bought with so much sacrifice, but eventually resulted in Marco's complete exoneration and issuance of an official declaration confirming he possessed completely legal permanent resident status and represented no threat whatsoever to public order or national security. Today, 3 years after that bureaucratic nightmare finally ended with complete victory in immigration courts, Marco and I have rebuilt our lives in ways even more solid than before, because the traumatic experience taught us valuable lessons about the importance of protecting our nuclear family against external threats regardless of where they come from, including biological relatives who prove toxic through malicious actions. We maintain no contact with Patricia since that final confrontation in her apartment 3 years ago, and this complete absence of maternal relationship hasn't created a painful void in my life as she had hopefully predicted, but rather a feeling of relief and emotional peace by eliminating a constant source of manipulation and potential danger to my family's stability. I learned painfully but definitively that true family is not defined by accidental biological ties, but rather by people who choose to love us genuinely, protect our happiness unconditionally, and celebrate our successes without destructive envy or need to control us to satisfy their own unresolved selfish needs. The final confrontation with Patricia on that rainy Sunday afternoon remains etched in my memory with disturbingly cinematic clarity that hasn't diminished even after 3 complete years have passed since that devastating moment of complete maternal revelation. When veils of protective denial I had unconsciously maintained over the true nature of my mother's manipulative and selfish personality were brutally ripped away, leaving exposed the naked and horrifying reality that the person who gave birth to me and supposedly loved me unconditionally was perfectly capable of calculated cruelty, designed to systematically destroy my marital happiness, simply because my independent adult life choices didn't conveniently align with her unresolved emotional needs after widowhood, that left her alone but that in no way justified attempts to manipulate her daughter's destiny through criminal methods disguised as maternal concern. When I definitively left her apartment that afternoon, leaving Patricia dramatically crying in the living room, surrounded by framed photographs of me at various ages that she obsessively kept displayed on all available surfaces, like a memorial shrine dedicated to the daughter she felt she had lost when I became an independent adult with my own life, separate from the codependent fantasies she had cultivated about our future relationship. I felt a complex mixture of contradictory emotions that included profound relief at finally understanding the real source of toxicity that had been poisoning my life for years without my fully recognizing it, genuine sadness at the necessary loss of a maternal relationship that, despite growing problems, still contained positive memories from my childhood, when Patricia had been a reasonably functional mother before loneliness and control became her dominant characteristics, and especially justified anger at the monumental betrayal she had perpetrated not only against me, but also against Marco, who had never done her any harm beyond the imaginary crime of having fallen in love with her daughter, and offered a healthy, loving relationship that naturally pulled me away from the claustrophobic maternal orbit Patricia wanted to maintain eternally. The process of emotional reconstruction after discovering the complete extent of Patricia's betrayal and making the definitive decision to completely cut off my relationship with her was a long and frequently painful journey that required not only conscious willpower, but also extensive professional therapeutic work to adequately process multiple layers of trauma, betrayal, unjustified guilt, and especially codependency patterns I had developed during decades of subtle conditioning, where Patricia gradually taught me through countless manipulative interactions that my primary function as a daughter was to satisfy her emotional needs, even when it meant sacrificing my own happiness and autonomy. Daniel had strongly recommended that we seek professional psychological counseling, not only to process the trauma of being targeted by a malicious complaint and invasive federal investigation, but especially because the experience of discovering that a close family member was responsible for such a calculated attack against our well-being created a specific type of psychological wound that wouldn't heal adequately without professional intervention, specialized in dysfunctional family dynamics and complex relational trauma. Jessica, I know therapy costs seem like a significant additional expense beyond the already exorbitant legal fees you're paying, but I can guarantee, based on decades of experience with clients who went through similar situations of family betrayal, that adequately processing this type of psychological trauma through professional therapy isn't an optional luxury, but rather an essential necessity to prevent long-term emotional damage that could affect not only your individual well-being but also the health of your marital relationship with Marco that will inevitably be tested by prolonged stresses from this legal process. Daniel advised us with wisdom that came from having repeatedly witnessed how immigration legal battles could destroy relationships, even when cases were eventually resolved favorably if the couple didn't receive adequate emotional support to process shared trauma constructively. Finding a qualified therapist who could help us navigate the specific complexities of our situation, involving maternal betrayal, immigration trauma, extreme financial stress, and especially challenges of maintaining a healthy marital relationship under extraordinary pressure from active federal investigation, took several weeks of research and initial consultations with various professionals who, although well-intentioned, didn't possess the specific experience necessary to understand the cultural and legal nuances that made our situation particularly complicated. Eventually, we were referred through an immigrant support network to Renata, a specialized family therapist of 51 years with particular expertise in working with multicultural families facing challenges related to immigration, trauma of separation from families of origin, and especially complex dynamics that arose when traditional family systems conflicted with needs for individual autonomy and construction of independent identities in a cultural adaptation context. Renata operated a modest private practice in a quiet professional building located in a tree-lined residential neighborhood far from the busy urban center. Her office intentionally decorated with elements promoting a sense of safety and welcome through soft lighting, comfortable but not excessively formal furniture, and especially complete absence of specific cultural symbols that could make clients from diverse origins feel excluded or judged by differences in background. During the first session with Renata that took place on a gray February afternoon, when melting snow created an unpleasant, muddy landscape that perfectly reflected the somber emotional state in which Marco and I found ourselves, after more than a month living under the shadow of immigration investigation with no resolution in sight, we told the complete story of recent events, including the visit from federal agents, discovery of the malicious complaint with disturbing specific details, the process of gradual identification of Patricia as the probable author based on exclusive access to detailed information mixed with clear motivation established through previous conversations about her desire for me to come back and live with her, and finally the devastating confrontation where she completely confessed her responsibility for the complaint, but tried to justify her actions through a distorted narrative where she was the victim of an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her to live with a foreigner. Instead of the heroine of her own story trying to rescue her daughter from a relationship, Patricia unilaterally judged inadequate based on cultural prejudices and especially unresolved selfish needs related to her own pathological loneliness. Renata listened to our long and emotionally charged narrative without interrupting, except to occasionally ask clarifying questions about specific details or particular relational dynamics, her professional expression maintaining a careful balance between validating empathy and therapeutic neutrality, necessary to help us process experiences without imposing premature judgments or interpretations that could unduly direct our own emerging understanding about deeper meanings of traumatic events. Jessica and Marco, I want first to validate that what you experienced through this malicious complaint and subsequent discovery that the person responsible was your own mother, Jessica, constitutes a serious form of relational trauma that has profound impacts not only at an individual level, but also on the foundation of trust that sustains your marital relationship, and especially on your ability to feel safe in a world where apparently even the closest people can reveal themselves as unexpected threats. Renata began her response after completely hearing our story, her words offering professional validation we both desperately needed after weeks of internalizing irrational guilt and constantly questioning whether there was something we had done to provoke or deserve such cruel treatment. What Patricia did wasn't simply an error in judgment or clumsy expression of legitimate maternal concern, as she tried to frame during your confrontation, but rather calculated abuse of intimate knowledge and family trust to inflict maximum possible damage in an attempt to control the life choices of an adult daughter who had every right to build an independent existence based on her own values and desires, rather than the mother's unresolved emotional needs. Hearing clear professional validation that I wasn't exaggerating the seriousness of Patricia's actions or being a cruel, ungrateful daughter by cutting off my relationship with her brought unexpected emotional relief that made me cry for the first time since the initial confrontation, tears releasing accumulated tension from weeks of trying to be strong and functional while internally processing guesses about whether I was responding appropriately to the impossible situation. Therapeutic work with Renata during subsequent months involved not only processing the specific trauma of Patricia's betrayal and immigration investigation, but also examining long-term patterns in the maternal relationship that had prepared the ground for final escalation to the extreme act of malice she eventually perpetrated. Renata helped us identify, through careful exploration of memories and historical family dynamics, that Patricia's behavior during years after my father's death had progressively become more controlling, manipulative, and especially dependent on me as the primary source of validation, purpose, and companionship she was unable to cultivate through healthy relationships with peers of her own age or through development of independent interests and her own social life separate from her role as my mother. What frequently happens in dynamics like what you describe with Patricia is that after loss of a partner through death or divorce, some parents begin to relate to adult children not as separate individuals with their own lives, but rather as substitutes for the lost spouse, or as extensions of themselves destined to fill emotional voids that should be addressed through their own psychological work and construction of appropriate support networks among peer adults. Renata explained during a particularly revealing session where we explored the evolution of Patricia's behavior over the years following my father's death. When an adult child establishes healthy boundaries and builds an independent life as you did by marrying Marco, emotionally healthy parents celebrate this independence as a sign of parental success, while parents with unresolved attachment problems and excessive emotional needs experience it as intolerable abandonment and may respond with progressive escalation of manipulative behaviors, trying to recover control over the child who is appropriately separating. Marco also benefited enormously from therapeutic work with Renata, particularly in processing the specific trauma of being targeted by an immigration investigation based on false accusations that temporarily transformed his legal identity from law-abiding permanent resident into potentially dangerous criminal suspect in the eyes of government authorities with power to completely destroy the life he had built through years of hard work and meticulous compliance with all regulations. Marco, what you experienced through this false complaint and subsequent investigation isn't just bureaucratic inconvenience or temporary misunderstanding, as the legal system tends to frame after favorable resolution, but rather a form of trauma that directly attacks the fundamental sense of existential security we all need to function effectively in the world. Renata validated during sessions where we focused specifically on his experiences and emotional responses to the events. For immigrants particularly, whose legal presence in the country of adoption depends on documentation that can potentially be revoked through administrative processes, threats to immigration status represent an especially visceral form of existential terror, because they signify not just loss of job or housing as native citizens might experience in crises, but rather complete loss of everything: career, community, most important relationships including spouse if deportation is forced, and especially identity constructed over years of cultural adaptation and establishment of life in the country that became true home, regardless of place of birth. Parallel to the essential therapeutic work that was helping us process emotional trauma constructively instead of allowing it to solidify into destructive patterns of chronic anxiety, pathological distrust, or toxic resentment that could have permanently poisoned our marital relationship, the legal battle against accusations in the malicious complaint continued advancing through the complex bureaucratic system of hearings, presentation of evidence, and especially agonizing waiting for decisions from immigration officials whose power over our destinies seemed disproportionate to the apparent arbitrariness of some of their procedures and evaluation criteria. The first formal hearing happened exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after the initial visit from federal agents to our house, held in an austere and deliberately intimidating government building, located in an unwelcoming industrial area of the city surrounded by vast parking lots and barbed wire that looked more like a detention facility than an administrative office designed to process immigration cases of people who, in the vast majority, were simply trying to build better lives through honest work. Daniel accompanied us to that first hearing and remained at our side during the entire process that lasted approximately 4 hours, including extensive periods of waiting in cold and uncomfortable hallways between different phases of the administrative procedure that seemed intentionally designed to be as stressful and dehumanizing as possible. During the hearing itself, held in a small and claustrophobic room with gray walls devoid of any decoration except official government seals and mandatory photographs of the president and other high-ranking officials, Marco was subjected to intensive interrogation by an immigration officer named Rodriguez, who conducted questioning with a mixture of cold bureaucratic professionalism and poorly disguised suspicion, suggesting presumption of guilt instead of presumption of innocence that should theoretically govern investigative processes, even in administrative rather than criminal contexts. Rodriguez asked dozens of detailed questions about every aspect of Marco's immigration history, forcing him to recite from memory specific dates, document numbers, addresses of previous residences, names of past employers, and especially details about our marital relationship, including invasive questions about how we met, when we decided to get married, who was present at the ceremony, and what kind of wedding gifts we received. The type of humiliating interrogation that treated our genuine love as potential immigration fraud, that needed to be proven legitimate through accumulation of mundane evidence, instead of being accepted at face value as an authentic relationship between two adults who chose to build a life together. Daniel intervened several times during questioning to object to questions he considered inappropriately invasive or irrelevant to specific issues raised in the original complaint. But Officer Rodriguez generally ignored objections, insisting he had broad administrative authority to explore any aspect of Marco's immigration situation he deemed relevant for complete investigation. After Marco's exhausting interrogation, it was my turn to answer extensive questions about our relationship, my understanding of his immigration situation, and especially about whether I had witnessed behaviors that could support the accusations in the malicious complaint about supposed domestic violence or illegal activities Marco was supposedly committing. Answering negatively to these loaded questions about whether my husband was violent or dangerous, while Officer Rodriguez observed me with a skeptical expression, as if I might be lying to protect an abuser, was one of the most humiliating and infuriating experiences of my adult life, making me feel as if I needed to prove the legitimacy of my own judgment about the person I had chosen to marry and share daily life with for years. Mrs. Anderson, you need to understand that victims of domestic violence frequently deny abuse or minimize violent behaviors due to fear of retaliation or due to complex psychological dynamics of abusive relationships. Therefore, your denial of problems is not necessarily conclusive for our investigation, Rodriguez said with a condescending, paternalistic tone, implying I was a potentially uninformed victim, incapable of adequately evaluating my own marital situation. Daniel immediately responded with a vehement objection about the impropriety of an immigration officer making speculative statements about supposed domestic violence without presenting any concrete evidence beyond unverified anonymous accusations, insisting that the type of psychological pressure Rodriguez was applying, through suggestions about my supposed inability to recognize abuse, constituted inappropriate investigative tactics that exceeded the limits of administrative authority. Despite the hostile atmosphere and negative presumptions that permeated that first hearing, Daniel managed to effectively present extensive documentation, demonstrating that Marco possessed completely legal permanent resident status, obtained through appropriate processes following all applicable regulations, that he had never been accused of any crime either in the current country or country of origin as verified through official criminal background checks from multiple jurisdictions, that our marriage was clearly legitimate based on extensive relationship documentation predating the marriage by years, including dated photographs, statements from friends testifying about the genuine nature of our relationship, financial records showing progressive mixing of resources over time consistent with a legitimately committed couple, and especially that the accusations in the original complaint about supposed illegal entry and fraudulent documentation were directly contradicted by official government records maintained by immigration services themselves, showing Marco's legal entry with a valid student visa and subsequent renewals and status changes, all officially approved by immigration officials after appropriate reviews. Officer Rodriguez, the documentation we presented today conclusively demonstrates that every aspect of the criminal accusations in the anonymous complaint against Mr. Marco Santos is factually incorrect and contradicted by official records from the government itself, Daniel argued during the hearing's final summary, his voice carrying controlled professional indignation about waste of government resources, and especially about trauma inflicted on an innocent family, through investigation based solely on unverified malicious accusations. We respectfully but firmly request that this case be immediately closed with official confirmation that Mr. Santos maintains valid permanent resident status and is not subject to any additional investigation or deportation proceedings. However, as Daniel had warned us during preparation, the immigration bureaucratic system rarely resolved cases immediately, even when evidence was overwhelmingly favorable to the immigrant, preferring instead to conduct prolonged investigations, following established protocols regardless of how obvious eventual conclusions might be to objective observers evaluating presented evidence. Officer Rodriguez concluded the first hearing, informing that he would need to review all presented documentation, conduct additional background verifications including possibly interviews with Marco's employers and other people who might have knowledge about his conduct and legal status, and especially that investigation of the original complaint would require determining whether the person who made accusations possessed information we hadn't disclosed, or whether the complaint was indeed malicious as we alleged. Preliminary decision on this case will be issued within 30 to 45 business days after complete analysis of all documentation and conclusion of necessary additional verifications, Rodriguez announced in a neutral bureaucratic tone, that completely ignored the human anguish that another month or more of uncertainty would cause us. Mr. Santos must continue appearing regularly for monthly status checks and must immediately notify this office about any changes of address, employment, or other relevant aspects of his situation while investigation remains active. The 43 days between the first hearing and receipt of the preliminary decision were a period of suspended anxiety where we tried to maintain the appearance of normal life through work routines, weekly therapy with Renata, and especially conscious efforts to nurture our marital relationship that was being severely tested by external stresses, but that fundamentally remained strong due to genuine love and mutual commitment that preceded the crisis and would continue regardless of the legal process outcome. Daniel kept us updated weekly about investigation progress as he received information from contacts within the immigration system, explaining that the case was following a relatively positive trajectory based on informal feedback he could obtain through unofficial channels, but repeatedly emphasizing we couldn't count on anything until we received an official written decision that would be the only thing with true legal force. During this agonizing waiting period, legal costs continued accumulating, while Daniel dedicated additional hours responding to requests for supplementary information from immigration services, preparing additional documentation that was periodically requested, and especially developing strategy to officially identify the origin of the malicious complaint. Because Daniel correctly believed that demonstrating malicious motivation behind false accusations would be a crucial element not only to guarantee favorable resolution of the current case, but also protection against possible future complaints if the responsible person decided to escalate a harassment campaign. Investigation to definitively identify authorship of the malicious complaint involved work by a private investigator hired through Daniel's office, specialized in tracing sources of anonymous complaints through analysis of digital records, language patterns in submitted documents, and especially through comparison of information contained in the complaint with knowledge that different people in our lives could plausibly possess. The investigator identified that the complaint had been submitted online through a public computer at a library located approximately 2 miles from Patricia's apartment, that the IP address used for submission corresponded to that specific library location, and especially that the submission time coincided with a period when Patricia had checked out her library card to use public computers according to records maintained by the library system. Although this circumstantial evidence was strongly suggestive that Patricia was responsible, it didn't constitute definitive proof because technically anyone could have used that specific computer at that time. Conclusive proof came when the investigator managed through a limited court order to obtain records of drafts saved in the library computer system, showing that someone using Patricia's login credentials had created multiple versions of the complaint during several visits to the library over 2 weeks before final submission, each version being progressively refined to include more specific details and more serious accusations, probably as Patricia researched what types of allegations would be treated most seriously by immigration authorities. Confronted with conclusive digital evidence definitively connecting her to authorship of the malicious complaint, Patricia initially tried to deny through an attorney she quickly hired. When Daniel formally notified her, we were considering both civil proceedings for emotional and financial damages and criminal proceedings for making a false complaint to federal authorities knowing the accusations were fabricated. However, when it became clear the digital evidence was irrefutable and continued denial would only worsen her potential legal situation, Patricia eventually admitted through her attorney that she had indeed made the complaint, but tried to argue she had acted based on legitimate concerns about my well-being rather than intentional malice. This transparent attempt to rewrite obvious motivations was quickly dismantled when Daniel presented additional evidence, including text messages Patricia had sent to her acquaintances weeks before making the complaint, where she explicitly discussed hopes that immigration problems could force Marco to go back to his country, resulting in my return to the maternal home. Confronted with this evidence of premeditation and clear selfish motivation, Patricia's attorney advised her to cooperate fully with the investigation and offer a sworn statement admitting that accusations in the complaint were false based on personal resentment rather than factual knowledge of any illegal activity. Hoping cooperation might mitigate potential criminal legal consequences for making a false complaint, knowing it was false. Patricia's sworn statement admitting responsibility for the malicious complaint and confirming all criminal accusations were completely fabricated without any factual basis whatsoever was the final piece of evidence Daniel presented to immigration services during the second formal hearing, scheduled after receipt of the preliminary decision that had been inconclusive, requiring additional investigation before final resolution. With explicit confession from the complaint's author admitting malicious fabrication of accusations and explaining selfish motivation unrelated to legitimate concerns about immigration law compliance or public safety, Officer Rodriguez finally had no choice but to issue a definitive decision completely closing the investigation against Marco, officially confirming he maintained valid permanent resident status without any violations or irregularities, and especially issuing a formal statement recognizing he had been unjustly targeted by a malicious complaint motivated by personal issues unrelated to his conduct or legal status. After complete investigation, including extensive review of documentation, multiple background verifications, interviews with relevant witnesses, and especially after receiving a sworn statement from the person responsible for the original complaint admitting accusations were false and motivated by personal family matters, this office conclusively determines that Mr. Marco Santos has not violated immigration laws in any way, maintains completely valid legal status as a permanent resident, and does not represent a threat to public safety or civil order. The final decision declared in formal bureaucratic language that transformed 8 months of nightmare into a simple administrative procedure closed without adequate acknowledgement of the human trauma the process had caused. Although the favorable final decision brought immense relief and finally allowed Marco and me to begin rebuilding the sense of security that had been shattered by the malicious complaint and subsequent investigation, the legal victory came with a devastating financial cost that would permanently alter our planned financial trajectory and delay by years objectives we had established for purchasing a larger house and eventually starting a family. Total legal costs over the 8 months of battle through the immigration system amounted to exactly $95,700, including Daniel's fees, private investigator costs, various document filing fees, costs of obtaining official certifications and translations of documents from Marco's country of origin, and especially costs of depositions and sworn statements from multiple witnesses Daniel had considered necessary to build the strongest possible case. This amount represented not only the entirety of our savings carefully accumulated during years of frugal living, but also required we take an additional loan of $30,000, using our house as collateral to cover final costs during the last months of the process when legal expenses escalated unexpectedly due to procedural complications and the need to conduct private investigation to definitively identify authorship of the malicious complaint. The financial impact of having spent almost $100,000 in legal battle to defend Marco against completely false accusations meant that plans we had carefully made for our future needed to be dramatically revised and especially postponed for an indefinite period, while we worked to rebuild destroyed savings and pay substantial debt we had accumulated. A larger house in a neighborhood with better schools where we planned to eventually move when we decided to have children became a dream postponed. For at least 5 to 7 estimated years, it would take us to save again the substantial down payment necessary while simultaneously paying current mortgage and additional loan used to cover legal costs. The decision to start a family that we had been seriously considering before the immigration crisis was also indefinitely put on hold because neither financially nor emotionally did we feel prepared to add the responsibility of raising a child while still recovering from trauma of recent months and dealing with stress of financial reconstruction. These losses of opportunities and forced delays in life milestones we had anticipated were real and lasting consequences of Patricia's malice that extended damages far beyond the period of legal investigation itself. The decision about whether we should sue Patricia civilly for financial and emotional damages caused by her malicious complaint was a difficult deliberation involving not only pragmatic legal and financial considerations, but also complex emotional questions about whether we wanted to maintain any form of connection, even if adversarial, with a person who had so clearly demonstrated her willingness to cause maximum damage to satisfy selfish needs. Daniel advised us we had a strong civil case to recover legal costs and potentially obtain additional damages for intentional emotional suffering, but also honestly warned that civil proceedings would be long, costly itself, although less than the immigration battle had been, and especially that chances of actually collecting a monetary judgment against Patricia were limited, given she lived on modest fixed income as a retired widow without significant assets beyond a small apartment that was protected from many types of judgment execution by state laws. You need to decide whether the potential to recover some portion of legal costs through civil proceedings against Patricia is worth the emotional cost of prolonging connection with her through litigation that could drag on for a year or more, especially considering that even if you win a substantial judgment, actual collection may be impossible or result in minimal monthly payments over decades. Daniel explained pragmatically during a meeting where we discussed post-resolution legal options. After much deliberation and several therapy sessions with Renata, exploring emotional implications of different courses of action, Marco and I jointly decided not to sue Patricia civilly, but rather simply move forward with our lives, maintaining complete and permanent distance from her. This decision was based partially on recognition that civil proceedings would likely result in minimal financial recovery that wouldn't justify emotional costs of prolonging involvement, but mainly on therapeutically informed understanding that the best way to heal ourselves and move forward would be through complete disengagement rather than maintaining any form of connection, even through an adversarial legal system. Sometimes the most significant victory isn't punishing the person who harmed us, but rather simply removing her completely from our lives and refusing to allow her to continue occupying precious emotional and mental space that could be dedicated to building a positive future. Renata helped us understand during the process of making this decision. Patricia made occasional attempts during the first months after final resolution of the immigration case to restore contact with me through letters sent by mail, messages left with mutual acquaintances, and even appearing once without warning at the hospital where I worked, trying to intercept me at the end of my shift. But I maintained firm boundaries I had established, refusing all contact, and eventually obtaining a limited restraining order when her contact attempts became sufficiently persistent to constitute harassment. The process of emotional and financial reconstruction after resolution of the immigration case and establishment of permanent distance from Patricia continued during subsequent years, and in many ways continues even today when I occasionally face unexpected triggers that temporarily transport me back to those terrible months of living under federal investigation, not knowing if Marco would be deported, destroying everything we had built together. Therapeutic work with Renata continued for approximately 2 years after formal resolution of the legal case, progressively decreasing from weekly to bi-weekly and eventually monthly sessions as we developed necessary emotional tools to process trauma independently, and especially as our marital relationship demonstrated remarkable resilience instead of fracturing under pressures that had been applied. Renata frequently commented during final sessions that the strength of our relationship after such severe adversity was testimony to the solid foundation we had built even before the crisis, and that couples who survived and thrived after shared traumas like ours frequently developed depths of intimacy and commitment that wouldn't be possible without having navigated together through storms that revealed each partner's true character. Financial reconstruction was a longer process and continues to be an ongoing project even 3 years after resolution of the immigration case. Payment of the $30,000 loan taken to cover final legal costs required significant sacrifices, including postponement of vacations, elimination of non-essential discretionary spending, and especially working additional overtime hours whenever possible, both for me at the hospital and for Marco at the restaurant. Marco eventually received a promotion to executive chef position, with substantial salary increase approximately 1.5 years after resolution of the immigration case, a promotion he had deserved for exceptional culinary skills and competent kitchen leadership. But that had possibly been delayed during the period when he was under investigation, and the restaurant had understandable concerns about hiring for a leadership position, someone whose legal situation was being questioned, even if unjustly. Marco's salary increase significantly accelerated our financial recovery, allowing not only faster debt payment but also restart of savings eventually destined for purchase of a larger house and starting a family that continue to be goals, although now planned for an extended time frame compared to the original timeline before the crisis. Today, 3 complete years after the final decision closing the immigration investigation and confirming Marco's complete legal status, our lives have superficially returned to an appearance of normalcy, resembling what we enjoyed before federal agents knocked on our door that freezing January morning that permanently divided our existence into before and after that traumatic event. Marco continues working as executive chef at the same restaurant where he built his reputation through years of exemplary professional dedication, now earning substantially higher salary that allows him not only to contribute significantly to financial recovery, but also to feel important professional validation for himself, esteem that had been temporarily shattered by the experience of being treated as a suspected criminal during investigation. I continue working as a nurse at the same hospital where I've been employed for more than a decade, having returned to the level of consistently excellent professional performance that characterized my career before the crisis, after an initial period of difficulty during the most intense months of investigation. The relationship between Marco and me not only survived extraordinary pressures, but in many ways strengthened through shared experience of navigating together through extreme adversity that revealed the depth of our mutual commitment, and especially demonstrated that bonds we choose to intentionally build are frequently stronger than accidental biological connections, when the latter are toxic rather than nutritional. The complete absence of relationship with Patricia hasn't created a painful void in my life, as she had hopefully predicted during the final confrontation, but rather a feeling of relief and emotional peace that came from eliminating a constant source of manipulation, unrealistic expectations, and especially demonstrated threat of causing maximum damage when her demands weren't satisfied. Occasionally, I receive indirect information about Patricia through distant acquaintances who aren't aware of the complete extent of the break between us, reporting that she apparently continues living alone in the same small apartment, that her physical health remains reasonably good for advanced age, but that she has developed a reputation among neighbors and casual acquaintances as a bitter and isolated person who constantly complains about an ungrateful daughter who abandoned her without ever mentioning the actions that led to that permanent and justified distancing. These occasional updates don't awaken desire to restore contact or even significant feelings of pity for the loneliness Patricia experiences, as a direct consequence of conscious choices she made by prioritizing selfish needs over her daughter's happiness and well-being. The most valuable lesson I learned through that devastating experience is that true family is not defined by accidental genetic ties, but rather by people who choose to love us genuinely, protect our happiness unconditionally, celebrate our successes without destructive envy, and respect our autonomy even when our choices don't align perfectly with their preferences or needs. Marco and I eventually began discussing again the possibility of having children as financial recovery progressed, and especially as we sufficiently processed the emotional trauma of previous years to feel emotionally prepared to add the responsibility of parenthood to our lives. These discussions naturally include reflections on how the experience with Patricia will inform our own approaches as future parents, particularly regarding the importance of raising children to be independent adults with separate identities rather than extensions of ourselves destined to satisfy unresolved emotional needs that should be addressed through our own psychological work. When we eventually have children, I want to ensure we raise them knowing our role as parents is to prepare them to eventually leave our home and build independent lives based on their own values and desires, not trap them through guilt or manipulation to remain permanently in the orbit of our emotional needs. I discussed with Marco during one of these conversations about future parenthood. The greatest evidence of parental success isn't having adult children who never leave or who organize entire lives around parents, but rather having adult children who are sufficiently secure and independent to build meaningful lives of their own, while maintaining healthy and voluntary connection with parents who respect their autonomy. Marco emphatically agreed with this vision of healthy parenting, adding his own perspective informed by his experience of having left his country of origin to build a life in a new place. A choice his own parents supported despite natural sadness of physical separation because they prioritized his happiness and opportunities over their needs to keep him geographically close. Another important legacy of the traumatic experience with Patricia's malicious complaint was heightened awareness about the specific vulnerability immigrants face through an immigration system that operates frequently more based on suspicions and rigorous enforcement culture than on presumption of innocence and protection of fundamental rights. This awareness motivated both Marco and me to become involved in volunteer work through a local immigrant rights advocacy organization that offers accessible legal support, education about rights and available resources, and especially advocacy for immigration system reforms that would be more just and less vulnerable to abuse through malicious complaints or bureaucratic errors, with potentially catastrophic consequences for people who built entire lives based on legal status that can be arbitrarily questioned. Marco participates especially actively through public sharing of his own story at community events and educational sessions, using the traumatic experience of having been unjustly investigated based on false accusations to illustrate needs for stronger protections against malicious complaints, and especially need for reforms that would treat documented immigrants with presumption of good faith rather than automatic suspicion when accusations are made. If anything positive can emerge from the nightmare we lived through, it's using the experience to help others who may be facing similar situations, and to advocate for systematic changes that would make it harder for ill-intentioned people to use the immigration system as a weapon against immigrants who diligently comply with laws. Marco occasionally reflects on the motivation behind his volunteer work. In retrospect, 3 complete years after final resolution of that traumatic but ultimately transformative chapter of our lives, I recognize with gratitude that although I would never have chosen to go through that devastating experience, and the financial and emotional costs were substantial and lasting, extreme adversity revealed important truths about the strength of our relationship. Importance of establishing firm boundaries even with family members when their behavior becomes toxic or dangerous, and especially about the fundamental difference between accidental biological family and intentionally chosen family based on genuine love, mutual respect, and shared commitment to each other's well-being. Patricia remains permanently excluded from our lives not out of cruelty or inability to forgive, but rather because healthy forgiveness doesn't require restoring access or relationship with a person who clearly demonstrated willingness to cause maximum damage when her demands aren't satisfied. We can forgive without forgetting, release toxic anger without restoring trust, and move forward with peace without allowing a harmful person to return to our lives. This crucial distinction between emotional forgiveness that frees the offended person from carrying destructive resentment versus relational reconciliation that would restore connection with the offending person was one of the most valuable therapeutic lessons Renata helped us understand during the healing process. When I occasionally share the story about how my own mother made a malicious complaint to immigration services trying to destroy my marriage because she wanted me to move back in with her, people frequently react with absolute disbelief about how a mother could do something so cruel to her own daughter. Demonstrating understandable difficulty, conceiving that maternal relationships can be profoundly dysfunctional and even dangerous when parents have unresolved psychological problems related to control, codependency, and narcissism that prioritizes their own needs over children's well-being. These shocked reactions validate that Patricia's behavior was indeed extraordinarily cruel rather than a simple common maternal judgment error, but also reveal how much society continues romanticizing biological family relationships as automatically positive and nurturing, ignoring the reality that genetic ties don't guarantee healthy love or appropriate behavior, and that sometimes protecting one's own well-being requires permanently cutting connection with toxic family members regardless of biological relationship. The message I try to convey when sharing the story isn't that all mothers are dangerous manipulators or that family relationships should be abandoned at the first sign of conflict, but rather that when biological family demonstrates through repeated actions, rather than simply words that they're willing to cause significant harm to satisfy selfish needs, individuals have not only the right, but also the responsibility to protect themselves and chosen families by establishing firm boundaries that can include complete, permanent distancing. Marco and I recently celebrated our 9th wedding anniversary with an intimate dinner at home elaborately prepared by Marco using refined culinary techniques he developed over years of professional growth. Our dining room simply but elegantly decorated with candles and fresh flowers, creating a romantic atmosphere that contrasted strongly with the simplicity of the occasion, marking not only years of marriage, but especially survival and strengthening of the relationship after being so severely tested by external adversity. During dinner, we talked honestly about the journey we traveled together since that terrible morning when federal agents knocked on the door introducing absolute chaos that could easily have destroyed a weaker or less committed marriage, acknowledging financial losses we're still recovering from, and emotional trauma that occasionally resurfaces through unexpected triggers, but especially celebrating the fact that we not only survived, but emerged with a deeper relationship and clearer understanding about what truly constitutes family and genuine love. Jessica, I'll never forget how you stood by my side unconditionally during those terrible months when I was being treated as a criminal and everything we built was threatened. That kind of loyalty and love isn't easily found and made me definitively understand that true family is what we build through conscious choices rather than genetic accidents. Marco reflected during a toast we made celebrating our anniversary and especially survival after the storm. I responded that loyalty was mutual, and that I deeply admired the dignity and strength he maintained during unjust investigation, refusing to allow the dehumanizing process to destroy his sense of self-worth or transform him into a bitter person despite having every right to feel anger about the injustice he had experienced. Looking toward the future, stretching ahead with renewed possibilities after years of careful reconstruction, I feel a mixture of cautious optimism about goals we'll eventually achieve, including a larger house and starting a family, and also profound gratitude for valuable lessons learned through an experience I never would have chosen, but that ultimately transformed me into a stronger person, more aware about the importance of healthy boundaries, and especially more appreciative of the genuine love Marco and I share, built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, honest communication, and unwavering commitment to each other's well-being above external pressures or expectations. The story I lived doesn't have a perfectly resolved ending with all wounds completely healed and all losses completely recovered, but rather a realistic conclusion where damage caused by Patricia's betrayal left permanent scars that occasionally still hurt, while simultaneously serving as constant reminders of important truths about autonomy, healthy boundaries, and the true nature of family we consciously choose to build rather than simply accept, based on accidents of birth. This nuanced understanding that healing doesn't mean returning to the previous state without changes, but rather integrating traumatic experiences into deeper and more mature understanding about the complex reality of human relationships is perhaps the most valuable legacy of that entire devastating ordeal that permanently transformed but didn't destroy my capacity to trust, love, and especially fiercely protect the family Marco and I consciously created against external threats regardless of their origins. Did you like Jessica's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll see you.